When you look into your creative space, what do you see? I see dried up paints, crusty old brushes, broken markers, and abandoned hobbies, and basically unfortunate reminders of failed creative endeavors. And it is negatively affecting how I feel about making art. I hope this isn't the case for you, but if it is, stick around because I'm going to be talking about how I'm going through it, both physically and emotionally, and I want to share what I've got going on with others. Hello and welcome back. If you're new here, I am an artist who took quite a long break from making art and is getting back into it. I've been recentering my life on art for the past year and a half or so, and I've made a lot of progress that I am really proud of. Today though, I'm going to be talking about an unforeseen challenge that I've been having, and that is the mental and emotional toll that my art supplies are having on me. So even though I didn't make art for years, I never got rid of any of my art supplies. I think that this is mostly because I was in denial about my creative status. So I didn't want to get rid of anything because to get rid of anything would be essentially an admission of not making any art. I would be admitting to myself that I wasn't going to need it anymore. And I had all this stuff just sitting on my shelves, and I would look at it every once in a while, and I would tell myself, like, oh, well, I'll get right to that stuff. I'll use it. I'll need it. I've just had a busy day, or I've had a busy week, or a busy year, or years, but I'm definitely going to get right back into it. And I told myself that for a really long time. And I think that to me, if I got rid of the stuff, that would be like a final admission of like, I'm never going to make art again. But we're going to let that be in the past and focus on where we are today. And today I am making art again, which is amazing. It has been so good and so fulfilling to get back into that creative practice that I've been missing for like a decade. But now that I am back in my art supplies and using this stuff, I am feeling really guilty. Each time that I go into my sketchbook or I go into my art supplies, I'm sifting through old stuff and old materials, and it really isn't going very well for me. So as an example, last week I was sitting down and I normally use like pens and ink in my sketchbook, but I wanted to switch it up and try some gouache. And I knew that I had gouache because I have a lot of art supplies. And so I went into my little area where I keep the supplies and I pulled the gouache out and I was so excited. And I went to twist the cap off and all of the paint was dry. It had hardened and dried inside the tube because it had sat for so long and I couldn't use it. But it makes sense because that paint was probably 10 years old, or honestly more, because I kind of think it was the gouache set that I had when I was in college, which was more than 10 years ago. So I didn't use gouache and I just sort of reshifted and I was like, well, I'll use markers instead. I've got markers. And I went and I got my set of markers out that were old and I hadn't used in a while. And I took the caps off of those, and the tips of the caps the tips of like the markers themselves had all dried out so much that they had crumbled into dust. Or like the tips had exploded because I guess the chemicals went bad inside of them. So totally unusable too. And at that point, I had encountered two totally ruined art materials that were just ruined because of disuse and neglect. And I put my art supplies away for the day and just decided, you know what, like I'm feeling really bad about this. I'm not making any art right now. And that was kind of a bummer. And up until last week, I had been aware of the art supply issue that I had, but I had been kind of just working around it and trying my best to ignore the not so gentle reminders of the wasted supplies and honestly the wasted creative years that I had sitting on my shelf. Again, I think because I was in denial. I didn't want to admit to myself that I had been so incredibly wasteful of my creative spirit and also like just on a very basic level, like the supplies. I didn't want to admit that I had done that to myself and to my things. And it feels bad to look at stuff that you have, that you bought, that you intended to use, that you then did nothing at all with. That is a bad, bad feeling. So today, I am done pretending that I don't have an art supply problem. I am taking responsibility for all of the crusty old materials that I have, the ancient art supplies that have just been lurking around my space and honestly hogging a lot of emotional energy from me. And I am holding myself accountable for the choices that I made in the past, but I am also letting them go today. And yes, this is technically a decluttering video. I will be going through my supplies and decluttering them, but I feel like this is a much more emotional and intellectual process than just cleaning and tidying. I'm not just getting rid of old stuff. I do feel like this is almost like shedding an old self, or almost like a phoenix, like rising from the ashes of old supplies, which I know sounds a little bit dramatic, and I don't feel quite that strongly about it, but I do really feel like I'm making space for a new self, a new version of me, just by getting rid of the old stuff and getting that stuff out of my life. So this week I settled in on the process of going through all of my art supplies. And it definitely wasn't the easiest thing that I've ever done, but it was nowhere near as hard as I'd built it up to be either. And I think that going through the process, it gave me an opportunity to reflect on the choices that I'd made in the past and also to kind of think about how I am different as a person and as an artist than I was when I was the person who bought all of these art supplies and then didn't use them and let them just sit. And I feel like I really gained a lot and I learned some things while I was going through these reflections. I did feel like it was important for me to see all of my art supplies in one space, so I started just by pulling everything off of my shelves, out of my drawers, off of my desk, and I had been dreading starting this because I have so much stuff, and I have for a long time. And I know that's the name of the game when you have a lot of different ways that you like to make art, but I have a lot of stuff. And I've always been a clutter bug and a messy person. That's just kind of how I am. And at this point in my life, I don't really think I need to change that, or whether or not I think I need to change that. That's a different experience overall. I'm not looking to change that about myself. This process for me was not so much about cleaning and organizing, although that was, of course, an added benefit to the process, and everything is a lot cleaner and a lot neater, and I'm very happy with it. But it was much more about taking an honest look at the art supplies that I have that no longer function and just letting them go. You know, I wish I had done things differently, and I wish that I had used the supplies, but I didn't. And so now we are here, and I need to accept the mistakes that I made, try to move on from them, and let the feelings of guilt associated with them go. I did feel a little bit better once I had all of my supplies in a pile because it actually turned out to be a lot less than I expected. Still a lot, do not get me wrong, I have a lot of stuff, but it was nowhere near the uncontrollable, overloaded pile that I had been imagining. I then sorted through all of my art supplies, so anything that was so old that it was unusable, I just tossed out. And this was definitely the most uncomfortable part because I hate being wasteful, and I was essentially just having to come to terms with exactly what I had wasted. But the silver lining of this was that there was actually a whole lot less of the trashed art supplies than I had anticipated. And I threw away a lot of it, but a lot of what I had was still very, very usable. And realizing that the unusable supplies were nowhere near as bad or as serious as I had thought, it was kind of an aha moment for me. I had been trying to ignore the problem of my supplies, and in the process of trying to ignore it, I had actually built it up in my imagination to be this huge, invincible monster, something that I was never going to be able to handle. But in reality, it was totally manageable. And if I just confronted my feelings about it in the first place, when it first started bothering me, I probably could have saved myself a lot of time where I was worrying, fretting, and feeling really bad about myself. So I'm going to try to remind myself of this instance the next time that I'm stalling on something or I need to deal with something, but I'm feeling intimidated by it or think it's too scary or too complicated or too hard, I'm going to remember this and remember how much easier and simpler it was than I thought it was going to be. I also set a lot of supplies aside if I didn't think I was going to use them. I had a lot of supplies from trying out different mediums that didn't stick, and I had a lot of doubled up supplies. And this was kind of a tough one too because I found a lot of things that I had multiples of. And I assume that is because I was just buying art supplies at one point and not even paying attention to what I had. I went through a phase a few years ago where I really wanted to get back into art. And so I aspirationally bought a bunch of stuff. And something that I learned then is that it's a lot easier to want to make art and to buy the supplies than it is to sit down and make the art if you're feeling kind of bad about it. And so I didn't use much of it. I just had a lot of things. And I really think that I was trying to like soothe the creative spirit that I had, soothe the artistic spirit by giving myself these like art supplies and the sketchbooks and the paints and the pens, but they weren't things that I needed. And in fact, I possibly already had them, which is how I ended up with multiples of these things. So these I plan to just donate to a creative reuse location. And that's a place where other artists and other makers can hopefully use and appreciate these supplies more than I can. If you have a creative reuse center anywhere near you, I highly recommend you check it out. They're amazing places. A lot of times they'll have really unique supplies or very old supplies. And I think it's so inspiring to go and just see what other people have dropped off and kind of just like, take inspiration from it. I also really love donating to them and supporting them because number one, they're reducing waste, which is amazing. Number two, they're supplying other artists with reduced price materials, which I think is just so cool. And if it's something that I already paid full price for, I would love for somebody else to get to enjoy it and appreciate it. And number three, they're usually very community driven and community minded. So the ones that I've been to often will have workshops and like lesson sections. And I just think that that's a very special thing that, I want more of that in my world. So definitely see if you've got one near you. They're usually like nonprofit or low profit or volunteer based as well. So perhaps you could even volunteer. And that left me with all of the supplies that were still usable and that I anticipated using. And it was still plenty of art supplies. I still have plenty to make all kinds of things with. It also did leave me with a few empty spaces in my art supply kit, and I'm thinking about how I want to replace them. I will probably end up doing a sister video to this one where I'm talking about my thoughts on replacing art supplies and buying art supplies because although I have gone through these old art supplies and I do feel like I've worked through a lot of the guilt that I was feeling in relation to being wasteful, I do have still some kind of complicated feelings about buying new art supplies. I'm like working through it, but I kind of need some time to, I think, process it. And I'm definitely not ready for any serious art shopping yet. But sometime in the future, I will probably sit down and talk with you all about those feelings. And I put everything back together and I'm feeling really pretty good about things. Of course, it's cleaner and it's tidier, and we will see how long that lasts. But more importantly, my work face just feels a lot better, and I feel like I've addressed something within myself that's been simmering, and maybe I'm ready to move past the guilt that I feel onto more optimistic feelings about making my art. It's never fun to confront something that makes you feel bad about yourself, but in the case of my art supplies, it just had to be done. I've been trying really hard to push past some of the mental hurdles that I've put between myself and the artistic practice that I want. And so, even though this was very hard for me to do, I feel like this was such an important exercise to get through and get to the other side of. And I think my main takeaway from this is that number one, if I start having like bad feelings about something, I really should just try to deal with it in the moment or as soon as I can, which like of course, like don't let bad stuff simmer on like below the surface. So trying to like handle things in a more timely fashion would probably make my life a lot easier. And number two, I'm gonna use my art supplies. I'm going to use my art supplies. You will not catch me with any more crusty old gouache, no more broken markers. We are changing things around here, and that is a guarantee. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing. I've been sharing a lot of my creative activities and talking about my thoughts and feelings with the experience of getting back into making art after such a long break. And I'm really looking to build a community of creative people that are interested in inspiring one another. And I did just recently post a video sort of detailing my 2026 creative goals. And I think that that gives a pretty good rundown of what I'm trying to do with my channel as far as this year, but also sort of other things that I'm working towards in the future. So if you're interested, check that out. And I hope that you are working on something that is making you happy, and I will see you next time. Bye!